All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. I'm so excited to have this conversation tonight. My name is Miller Coffey, and I am the Communications and Engagement Coordinator at Piedmont Environmental Alliance. First, I want to take a moment to just tell you a little bit about who we are and why we're hosting this event. Piedmont Environmental Alliance is a nonprofit based here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and our mission is to create create a more just, resilient, and sustainable community. And so what we're doing in order to accomplish that goal is to educate and empower. So we reach over 4,000 students each year in Winston-Salem Forsyth County schools with our education programming. We're building community, so we host events like the Piedmont Earth Day Fair, which is the largest environmental education event in our region and the largest Earth Day event in our region. And we inspire action. So we advocate at the local level for environmental policies and practices, whether that be with government agencies or with businesses or other nonprofits. Really what we're doing is trying to change this system in a way to make sure that our city is future forward and is the most just, resilient, and sustainable it can be. And so what we're doing here tonight is that we are having a conversation with two of our friends, Dr. Stan Meiburg and Minor Barnett, and I'll introduce those folks here in just a moment. And the reason that we're doing this is because as you might have noticed on social media today, today is the first day of early voting. And what we know about voting is that it is one of the best tools that we have to make our voices heard, and especially when it comes to environment and climate change. A lot of people, underestimate how much all levels of government have to do with the air we breathe, the water we drink, the green spaces available in our city, and so much more. A lot of people think about environmental legislation and they think about things like the Green New Deal or the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. And those are certainly big environmental policies or proposals that on a national level seek to make change. But what we want to do here tonight is bring this back in and think about how these larger programs and larger pieces of legislation are actually implemented at the local level. So before we get to that, I do want to point y'all in the direction of a couple of resources that we have here at PEA. So we have a tool right now to make a plan to vote. If you go to www.peanc.org/vote and make a plan to vote, we will not only send you a reminder about your voting plan, but you'll also get one of these really neat stickers, and I'll hold one up in real life so you can kind of see what they look like. But we're giving these away because we really know that when people make a plan to vote, it can make them up to 10 times more likely to make it to the polls. And so we want to get as many folks out there to do that as possible. The other thing that I want to bring your attention to is that just last week, PEA published a candidate survey. And so one thing that we always hear is that people don't know where people like their county commissioners or their city council members stand on environmental issues. And so what we did was we worked with the Wake Forest Office of Sustainability to come up with this candidate survey that asks questions about all kinds of topics ranging from air quality and water quality to transportation, climate change, and renewable energy. And we surveyed every candidate up and down the ballot in both Forsyth and Guilford counties. And so if you're wondering what your local candidates think about these topics, I totally encourage you to go and download our survey. It's a really great resource for folks to use to find out where these folks stand. And so that's all I will say on that. And I would love to introduce our guest for the evening. We have Dr. Stan Meiburg, who is the former acting deputy administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency and is also the leader of the Sustainability Graduate Program at Wake Forest University. We also have Miner Barnett, who's the executive director of the Forsyth County Office of Environmental Assistance and Protection. And I'll turn it over to y'all to tell a little bit more about yourselves. So let's start with Dr. Meiburg.
Oh, gracious. Thank you very much, Miller. Now, I'm delighted to be back in Winston-Salem, and probably the most significant thing for this group is that I had a very long career at EPA, 39 years before coming to academia. So working in both headquarters and regional offices of EPA. So I kind of got around to a lot of different programs and was very fortunate in my career. But I am a Wake Forest alumnus, class of 1975, and lived in Winston-Salem as a child between 1957 and 1964. So there is a degree to which this is a homecoming experience for me, and I'm very grateful for it.
Thanks, Dan.
And my name is Miner Barnett. I've worked for Forsyth County government for, this is my 34th year. And the mission of my agency is to protect public health and the environment by preventing pollution and, educational and regulatory responsibilities that we try to fulfill in the community. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, y'all. So before we get started with our questions for the evening, I want to just kind of preface how this event will go. We really want this to be an opportunity for folks in our community to ask questions of Dr. Meiburg and of Miner because they have such a wealth of knowledge about these issues. And so we have prepared a few questions, and I'm sure that we could go on all night, but we really want to give y'all the opportunity to chime in as well. And so in a little bit, I will open up the floor for participant questions. You can feel free to either at that point unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it in the chat box, whichever one is most convenient and easiest for you. But until then, I will ask that everyone stay muted just to make this as pleasant of an experience for everyone that we can. So without further ado, I will start with the first question for our panelists this evening, which is, what issues related to environmental sustainability and climate change can the federal government address? And what issues can our local government address?
Well, I guess I should take that one first. And when I saw this question, I was reminded of one of the best slogans about the environmental movement, which was "Think globally, act locally." And the main point I want to come across is that the system works best when all three levels from a governmental standpoint, the system works best when all three levels, federal, state, and local, are doing the things that they are well suited to do. And you can look at it sort of at a number of different levels. For example, there are system issues that really do take national leadership. On the other hand, you don't want people to be just waiting on Washington either. Let's think about climate just as an example. There are really 5 major sectors that you think about when you're trying to figure out a strategy for reducing carbon emissions. There's electric power, transportation, the built environment, manufacturing, and agriculture. And each one of those sectors is a little bit different. On electric power generation, you have a combination of things going on at both the national and the state level where you really need to have leadership. It's been interesting to see how utilities themselves are now coming forward, making pledges that may for them be aspirational, of not knowing how exactly they're going to meet them, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. And wouldn't it be nice if the federal government and state and local governments were all pulling in the same direction on that? So we can hope. On transportation, you really got to have national leadership. The automobile manufacturing is a national industry. California has, for decades, has exercised a leadership position, and they continue to do that, but it really is going to take national leadership to address things in that sector, both in terms of individual cars, as well as thinking about a transportation system that's not quite so dependent on cars. The built environment, on the other hand, is something that really works best at the state and local level because it relates almost directly to land use and building codes and things that are not, the federal government may have some role in giving prototypes and designs, but that's really a local government responsibility. Manufacturing as well, even though there are national standards for large types of manufacturing, local and state relationships matter a lot there. And then finally, agriculture is kind of a mixed bag. And so in all of the areas, you need some combination of national system change and local initiative, but the balance of that may vary from sector to sector. Just to I realize it's a long answer, but I had one other point I wanted to make, which was that when you think beyond climate change, you think about such things as water quality and drinking water and waste management. A lot of those really do devolve directly to local leads, with the federal and state government standing in more of a support role, for example, in financing for infrastructure improvements. But when you get down to such questions as, how's your local sewer system operating? Are you having sanitary sewer overflows? How good is the drinking water? How is your local municipal environmental recycling facility working? Designs on local building projects. Are people looking at non-structural alternatives for stormwater runoff or buffers or things like permeable pavement and those kind of things? That's really about local building codes and principles. And then finally, even on transportation, are you doing things at the local level that increase the safety of alternatives to cars, like bike lanes? How good is your interconnected bike network to enable people to use them to get around for more than just recreation or exercise? So so as you might imagine, there's plenty of work for everybody. It's not like one group has to dominate. I do think, just to go back to my earlier point, though, that we're in an era now where just waiting on Washington to take the lead is not the best strategy. The best strategy is to figure out what are things you can do that contribute to the larger global picture, if you will. So the think globally, act locally is as true as it ever was.
Very well stated, Stan. I completely agree. And, you know, the collaboration, the importance of the collaboration that he referred to a couple of times cannot be overstated. Local governments need to stay in close contact and communication with, you know, our state colleagues and also federal. And so, like within my agency, you know, we have a lot of communication internally. We have a lot of communication with the state of North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality. We're in constant contact with the Region 4 staff, with the EPA Region 4 office in Atlanta and Research Triangle Park outside Raleigh. And, you know, I think that education is important. And so at the local level, having, you know, public policies that make it easy for citizens to make good decisions and responsible choices in their daily lives are an important component in my opinion, of good governance from an environmental perspective. And something that the county has done recently that you know, reflects some goals and aspirations, I guess, at this point, is a commitment to the county commissioners adopted a resolution in December to commit to trying to move all county facilities, operations, including transportation, away from fossil fuel derived energy dependence. So that would include our transportation, our fleet of motor vehicles, our emergency vehicles, the electricity to operate all of our buildings and facilities. And it's really exciting that the political will was demonstrated by the fact that the board adopted that resolution unanimously to try to move away from fossil fuels to cleaner, more sustainable and renewable energy sources across all of the county's operations and facilities. And a lot of us are really excited about it, even though it's a somewhat daunting task to get the planning process off the ground and identify the logical first steps in a very positive direction. But I'm, you know, proud to be part of the organization who is demonstrating that commitment. Thanks.
Those are great responses. I think it's so important to highlight how federal and local and statewide government can really work together to solve these problems and to put us in a place where we're never truly out of options. There's always something that we can do and something that can be done. And so I think that's a great lead in to our next question, the reason I'm going to ask this question is because when I first came to Dr. Meiburg and to Miner to ask them to do this event, the reason why I did it is because I personally had a fundamental, not really very big understanding of how environmental policy gets translated from the federal to the local level. And so I'd like to see if y'all can explain for our audience here what individuals and bodies are responsible for environmental policy at the federal and local level, and also who makes those decisions that impact our environment, and which bodies or individuals do you think are most responsive to our concerns from citizens?
Well, Miller, I'm smiling at this because Gwyneth is probably laughing her head off listening to this thing, because that's basically the whole course. So short of giving a semester-long answer to that question, I'll see what I can do. The answer sort of, and I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over the whole congressional thing, even though Congress is very important in setting environmental policy at the federal level, certainly. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Congress has done what it's going to do. As obviously EPA is very important, but with the EPA, it's important to recognize that EPA has a somewhat decentralized structure, that your headquarters offices are responsible for many of the rules and regulations, but the actual execution and implementation of those in partnership with states, and that states in fact have delegated authorities under most statutes to fully carry them out. But the responsibility of EPA exists, as Miner said earlier, with the regional offices. And this state, the state of North Carolina, is in Region 4, which is headquartered in Atlanta, and where I worked for many years. And so the regional offices in EPA world sit at the absolute intersection of two competing tensions in environmental policy, between national consistency on the one hand and local flexibility on the other. And the challenge and the art of it is to have those not be antithetical to each other, which is to use the creativity that you see at the local level to still achieve consistent national goals. That is sometimes harder than it sounds. So that the EPA structure has both headquarters and regional offices, and then the state structure, the State Department of Environmental Quality, headed by Secretary Regan, is the primary implementation arm for environmental policy in the state of North Carolina. But even in North Carolina has a governance structure on top of that from the rulemaking standpoint, and it's called the Environmental Management Commission. And this is a citizen commission composed of 15 people. There are some qualifications requirements for the 9 appointees that the governor appoints, and then 6 of those commissioners are appointed by the legislature. And the commission, and I am the chair, and the commission has to sit and to pass on all regulations that are adopted by DEQ before they can fully take effect, which involves a lot of work. So that's, and DEQ is, or the commission, it can be very responsive to citizen initiatives, and I'll just give 2 relatively recent examples. One was a petition for the reclassification of the freshwater sandy bottoms wetlands in Buncombe County, which is an area of highly pristine and unique flora and fauna. So the citizens up there petitioned to have that become a classified, instead of just a wetland, to be a unique wetland, which gives it additional protection. And that petition process came to the commission heard it, the commission approved it, and directed the department to develop a regulation to implement it. The department did, and we took final action on that in July. So that was a direct response to a petition by citizens to try to give additional protections to a valuable wetland area. And there's another example going on now about a reclassification of the Lower Cape Fear River, which is out for public hearing on reclassifying. There had been an effort to classify that as a swamp, which really kind of wasn't. So there was a petition to undo that, and we're in the middle of doing hearings on that now. So those are two examples of responsiveness to petitions coming directly from citizens with the commission. But I will say that I think Minor's work in many ways is the absolute front line, because when something goes wrong in Forsyth County, they call him. They don't usually call Region 4. They don't usually call DEQ. They call him. And so the Jeffersonian notion of sort of locally responsive government, I think, is still alive and well within the environmental protection system. But it is a sometimes complicated system, and responsiveness sort of occurs at a lot of different levels. Sorry for the long answer.
I can attest that we do call Minor. He is very, very important.
Well, and depending on what the topic of interest is, if it's something that falls within the scope of our responsibilities, if the citizen calls EPA Region 4 or North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, they will be given our phone number if it's something that we deal with. And we do pride ourselves as a local agency for being able to respond quickly and provide prompt and personal services and oversight in the county of Forsyth within the limits of our authority. And, you know, we do what we do. I can honestly say all of my staff have selected their career, and most of them have been with us for a long time because they believe in the importance of our mission and the impacts that we have on the community, you know, in a positive way. But there are a lot of checks and balances, so that if we as a local agency are either too stringent or too lenient in our decisions and our execution of our duties, you know, there are checks and balances to keep us in line. For example, the Environmental Management Commission, our authority to exist as an air protection agency is delegated from the EPA under the Clean Air Act through the state of North Carolina's Environmental Management Commission to empower us to adopt local regulations and carry out the enforcement of those regulations. And if we fail to do so the way we're supposed to, then the Environmental Management Commission and the EPA can step in and take action and make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to do. So it's not, you know, as a local agency, you know, we try to be consistent with the state and federal implementation plans and, you know, enforcement strategies. But at the same time, I do think that in a lot of cases, we're able to respond more quickly and provide a really personal response. And since a lot of people don't know this, I just want to mention that, you know, there are 100 counties in North Carolina, and 97 of those counties receive regulatory oversight and services through the Department of Environmental Quality's Division of Air Quality. And I'm not talking about water at this moment. I'm talking about air because that's most of what I do. But 3 counties, Buncombe County, Mecklenburg County, and Forsyth County, have a local air agency that implement the provisions of the Clean Air Act within our county jurisdictions. And we talk to each other daily. I mean, we are very good friends, and we're in close communication. The 3 local agencies talk to each other. We talk to the state agency literally on a daily basis, and we all work together. We share information, we share resources, we brainstorm together to troubleshoot issues, that complex issues that might be difficult to solve. And it's a really positive thing. And I think if most of you could see what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak, you would be pleased that, you know, as public employees, that we're doing what we're doing at the level that we're doing it with a great amount of commitment and communication and collaboration, which again is vitally important to our success.
And I really want to echo what Minor just said and put an emphasis point on it, because he's right. There's so much that goes on that's not generally seen, but when you have those kind of healthy networked relationships, it makes the whole system stronger, because there are tools that different levels have that others don't. It's not possible for somebody sitting in Atlanta to have the same on-the-ground appreciation for a situation that Minor is going to have. But sometimes Minor will come up against a situation where he may not have the technical tools of the sampling capability or analytical capability or something that the state or the EPA can help provide. And we always prided ourselves in the years I was in Region 7 to when that was the case, we wanted to step in there and be a full partner with folks to help get the job done. And I will say that it was my experience in Region 4 that set of network partnerships between the region and the state agencies and the local agencies was really, really quite strong and healthy, and has been for some time. And you don't hear about it much, partly because it works well.
That's great. I love the responses that really emphasize these collaborations and how people have to really work together to make these things work. And Minor, I especially like that you touched on how local people can impact change here. I want to give a quick example of how we at PEA have seen this work in our community. So just this spring, we partnered up with the Sierra Club and Citizens Climate Lobby and the Climate Reality Project and some others to try and pass a resolution at the county level for our county to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2050. And one thing that was so wonderful about doing this at the local level is that we don't have to wait for the federal government to pass something. You know, if local communities, say if every city the size of Winston-Salem or bigger passed these resolutions on our own, well, then federal policy would just be a no-brainer. And so what we really want to do is say we're going to lead the way with this. But one reason that I really admire the work of our local public servants is that we had the opportunity to communicate with our county commissioners, to communicate with Minor and other folks, and to work with them to come up with and ask for a solution that really fits with what our community can do. And it was so empowering just to be able to work with folks on a local level, to know their names, to be able to see them face to face. And now you can't, but back then you could. And just to be able to have a real conversation about where our community is going. And we had so many people in our community, hundreds of people who signed a petition to move that resolution forward. And it was a huge bipartisan success, thanks to our community mobilizing and to our local officials and public servants who are really dedicated to hearing the concerns of citizens. So I just wanted to kind of briefly say, you know, how we have seen here in our own community that we can impact people or impact policies in this way. And so the next question that I have is, I was wondering if y'all could talk a little more about how environmental policies and regulations are enforced, and what are the challenges that come with enforcing regulations and policies?
I don't know, Minor, you may want to go with that one first, because, and I'll set the stage for that by just noting that well over 90% of all the enforcement of environmental regulations occurs at the state and local level. The major environmental statutes like the Clean Air Act, and most of y'all on this call probably know this, the major environmental statutes are all set up to enable states to take delegation of the basic permitting and enforcement activities that are authorized by those statutes. And so, and that since the 1970s, when these laws got passed, that's all been done pretty much. So the vast bulk of the work occurs at the state and local level, and EPA tends to get involved in enforcement cases only that are really large, or that represent some egregious kind of violation, or that cross state lines or involve large corporations or things like that. So maybe Minor, you might want to go with that first.
So, you know, you mentioned the challenges. So let me start there, and then I'll move in a more positive direction. But, you know, from my perspective, given the growth of population in the world and in our area, and the increasing density of human inhabitants, and the transitions that we've seen from, you know, farms becoming residential subdivisions, or you know, additional business facilities being built, we're having trouble keeping up. And it's largely because I think most agency directors like me, if they were comfortable enough to be honest, would tell you that our efforts are resource limited and that we have to do the most important things every day that we can do and address issues that either affect the largest number of people or could potentially have the largest effect on some people or do the most damage to the environment that would be felt for a long time. And it's difficult sometimes to go to sleep at night knowing that everything that we're responsible for is not getting done because we don't have enough people and enough resources to do 100% of the work and fulfill 100% of the responsibilities. But we do the most important things every day. And an example would be, we could have one of my staff members could be working on an important project that's a kind of a long-term project that's going to take several weeks to complete. And we get a phone call from somebody saying, oh my gosh, my neighbor just set a couch on fire in the backyard. And so we have to drop what we're doing and run out there to where that is occurring to communicate with the person responsible and make sure they know first they need to put the fire out. Then we need to explain to them why you're not allowed to burn furniture in the backyard. And, a lot of times the call will be, my kids couldn't play in the yard today because something the neighbor was doing. And since we're in these uncertain times, as we say, with more people spending more time at home, we've seen an increase in occurrences of events like I just described. And it's also more likely that someone is also at home nearby to be affected and call us about it. So we're doing a lot more, local response of that type. And, as a local regulatory agency, we deal with a range of issues from an individual person doing something that we need to talk to them about and maybe make them stop, all the way up to like large corporations that employ hundreds of people and have, emissions of air pollution in the hundreds of tons a year. And so it's a wide range of within the scope of our responsibility. And honestly, the former, being the individual citizens, can potentially be more challenging for us to effectively communicate with than the business entities, because we don't really have too much trouble with the businesses, large or small businesses. Usually they're more than willing to work with us to restore compliance and maintain compliance, and we're kind of on the same team. But it can be difficult, especially in the last few years. I think it's gotten more challenging to try to communicate with individuals, and I'm sensitive to this, but there are times that we have to tell someone what they're allowed to do on their property. And if they're burning garbage in the backyard or burning furniture in the backyard, we have to make them stop. Or if they're accumulating solid waste or burying it in a pit or doing something like that. So in addition to the air quality work, our agency also administers and enforces the provisions of the county code that address solid waste and recycling in the unincorporated area of the county. So illegal dumping, open burning, collection services. If somebody calls and says the garbage truck is leaking liquid on the road in my neighborhood, if it's within our jurisdiction, we contact that service provider and help them figure out what they need to do to keep the hydraulic oil or the garbage leachate from escaping and contaminating the environment in the neighborhood where that might have occurred. So it's a lot of fun. We really feel good about what we do when we're successful. There are limitless challenges, and when we go to work every day, most of us have a plan for what we're going to do for 8 or 10 hours today. And a lot of days at the end of the day, we have 10 open tabs on our computer or open windows on the computer, and very little of what we thought we were going to do got done because there was other stuff that happened that is important and needs to be addressed right now.
Boy, Miner just gave you a primer on frontline environmental leadership right there, because that interface between citizens and your government is really interesting and important, and both important and challenging. That as Miner said, that so when you get into the more formal parts of the enforcement process, which is kind of the back end, that the first thing is you get a complaint like that, you go out and you try and convince the person against whom the complaint is lodged to stop doing what they're doing. And if that negotiation goes well, then the system has done its job and that's the end. But sometimes it does not, as he said. And then you get into more formal kind of procedures where there's a notice, there's a formal inspection, a notice of violation, there's an administrative hearing process, there can be fines and penalties. The Environmental Management Commission actually has a civil penalties committee that is the one that finally reviews determinations that are made by the state as to whether they should be approved. And my experience has been that those civil penalty committees give a pretty fair amount of deference to the state unless the story just seems out of whack somehow. But it's designed by the state's laws to have the last review on that be from people who are in some ways citizens themselves, which is kind of an interesting philosophy of governance. So I think somebody who found themselves in that position can feel that they get every opportunity to be treated fairly. But at the same time, if somebody is just basically ignoring the efforts to enforce the law, they don't get much sympathy on those civil penalty committees. So that's how some of the more formal processes work. This is putting aside the question if you find yourself in the middle of a federal enforcement action. There are really very few individual citizens who would find themselves in that position. Every now and then there were a few wetlands cases that kind of got that way, but generally that would sort of the old sort of not a federal case means that it should be handled at the state or local jurisdiction level. But and when you get into federal enforcement cases, you're into pretty serious business. The federal government has immense authority, but just because you have immense authority doesn't mean you always use all the authority you have, that's the wisest course of action.
Those are great insights. I'm learning a lot from y'all. Thank you so much for sharing about that. I'm wondering.
So one more quick,
One
more quick comment about the enforcement end of things, which, we always, it's more satisfying to us to be successful using the carrot than having to pull out the stick, as they say. But occasionally, and it's not very often, but occasionally, after we've exhausted all efforts possible to communicate and negotiate and persuade someone to do what we need them to do, if they're a repeat offender or have an ongoing violation that's serious and we're not successful at getting them to change their behavior or their practices, a few times a year, we have to take an enforcement action that involves the court system. And for some of our stuff in air quality, it might be the civil route, but in things like solid waste and some of the open burning and some of the other things under Chapter 19 of the county code, which is the solid waste and recovered materials chapter, we take the criminal route. And the reason I'm bringing that up right now is, when we charge someone with a low-level misdemeanor criminal charge because of a local environmental activity that they've been engaged in, we always first I always tell the judge that we have no interest in seeing anyone punished, and actually if they go to jail, they're not going to be able to do what we need them to do because they're not going to be available to do what we need them to do. But also because these are not high-level felony crimes, all of our cases are heard in the same courtroom, and that courtroom has been shut down since April or May. And when we go to court, it's not unusual at all for the docket to have over 100 cases on the calendar for that day, and every one of those cases will be heard. So, some of them will be continued, and some of them will be automatic guilty pleas or voluntary dismissals that are quick, but they'll run through all of them before they finish the business for the day. And it's hard for me to get my head around the idea that that courtroom has been closed for 5 months or more, with that backlog building. And this week we had to get the magistrates to sign 6 misdemeanor criminal summonses for people that we've been struggling to deal with for over a year or sometimes 2 years, knowing that, our cases probably won't get scheduled on the calendar for maybe another year because they'll have to overcome the backlog before they can start, working on the things that are coming in now. And so it's this pandemic is having a big impact on a lot of levels of government actions and activities. And, we're still having to communicate with people. And, so now we're telling them, well, we don't know how much more time you have, but you need to use the time that you have to start making incremental progress on what we've been trying to get you to do. And we promise we'll take a voluntary dismissal when the day comes if you just do what we've been asking you to do for the benefit of the community.
That's interesting, Minor, because we've had the same problem on the commission. The Civil Penalties Remissions Committee hasn't met since the pandemic started, because there's some argument in state law that people who are going to appeal their cases to the Civil Penalty Remissions Committee have the right to be able to do so in person, and which we hadn't been able to do. So there's a backlog at that end too. It's not nearly the size of the one you described, but it's a real issue.
That is so interesting to think about, because one thing that I was thinking about is you were talking is that, climate change poses a threat for more times like this. As climate change progresses, our risk of having other diseases that cause COVID-like shutdowns make it hard for us to be around each other. The more natural disasters we have that shut everything down and make it hard for people to get to court, it's kind of, it feels like it's burning a candle at both ends in a way, to have everything shut down due to environmental issues, and to also not be able to enforce environmental policies because things are shut down. So that was really interesting to me. I think at this point, I have one more question, which was why voting matters when it comes to environmental policies. But we're coming up close to time, so I'm going to open it up for the audience to ask questions. And if you can find a way to explain how voting matters while we do that, that would be great.
Oh boy. Well, while you're waiting on a question, you just can't emphasize how much that's the case. And I'll give you an example, is that in the eastern part of the state, the legislature enacted, as part of a larger utility bill, a moratorium. This is a few years ago. They enacted a moratorium on wind energy placements in the eastern part of the state. And the ostensible reason was that they were concerned about interference with operations as part of the armed forces. Well, there's an armed forces review committee that looks at all potential sightings of wind energy. So that was just a non-issue, but it got styled that way and framed that way, and so that it got shoved into a must-sign bill. Well, that happily the legislature only imposed after an 18-month period, and in the meantime we had an election, which meant that the veto-proof majority went away. So when the bill came up again, the advocates for continuing to limit the use of renewable wind energy in the eastern part of the state were not able to succeed in getting a version of an extension of the moratorium that would pass. And that occurred because people voted in 2018. Now, there's bipartisan support in the legislature for renewable energy. Don't get me wrong, but that to me was a very specific example in North Carolina of why the voting for people who are thinking about sustainability and renewable energy and reducing our environmental footprint is really, really critical.
That's great, Stan. It looks like we have a question from Janet.
Hey, so this question is for Minor. So I'm really proud that the county commissioners passed the resolution that they did, and the coalition that worked with the county commissioners is now trying to work with the city council of Winston-Salem to pass a similar resolution. My question to you is, if they were to pass a similar resolution, how do you see the county and city being able to work together? How will it benefit the county if the city were to pass something similar?
Well, we're all in this together. And if we were both working towards a common set of goals for each unit of local government, it would make it pretty easy to collaborate on the research that needs to be done to determine, we need to determine what we have, what we need, what's available. And, in my 34-year career, I think I've observed that the most likely way to make progress in a positive direction is to identify like reasonable incremental steps in that direction. And I think that if the city of Winston-Salem, being the large municipality within this county where a lot of the people, the majority of the people live, and other municipalities within the county and region, we're all aligned and pursuing similar goals, aspirations, and interests, then it would be easy for us to share information and support each other in our research efforts. And, you know, following the adoption of Executive Order 80 by the governor, you know, the state has drafted a really impressive clean energy plan for the state of North Carolina that, you know, I'm hopeful I'll be able to read it in its entirety in the near future and incorporate some of the concepts, you know, at the county level, which could also be incorporated at the city level. But with that said, you know, there are some differences in the two units of local government. You know, the county commissioners are, you know, in some way, I mean, they represent everyone in the county inside including the people inside the municipalities, but they also represent all the citizens that live in the unincorporated areas and in the other municipalities besides Winston-Salem, where the Winston-Salem City Council is more focused on what's going on in their jurisdiction, you know, in the wards within the city limits of Winston-Salem. And I think the people that have lived here a long time that are paying attention have observed trends in maybe some different philosophies underlying some of their decisions and their approaches to providing good local government. But I'm not sure if I've even answered your question, but those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you. You did answer my question. I appreciate it.
Any other questions from the audience? You can either unmute, raise your hand, or use the chat box.
Yeah, I have a question. I forgot how to raise my hand. But so this can be for either of you or both of you. But, you know, I was reading some articles lately about Gen Z and the rising like climate anxiety of our generation. So I was just wondering if you guys had, you know, just some hopeful words for young people that are very concerned about our climate, but don't necessarily. So go ahead. Wait, what? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dr. Meiburg.
Sure. No, I'm happy to. And you know, this is one of those cases where you have to balance hope with realism, in that we do face a tremendous challenge here, that the carbon we've already put in the atmosphere is going to be having consequences for the climate of the planet now for decades to come. And that is in fact a reality. But it's like the old saying, what do you do if you're in a hole? And the answer is, the first thing you do is you stop digging. So we have to adopt measures that will try to minimize our carbon footprint. The optimism I see is that in those sectors that I was describing, I can see very positive trends on both the electric power generation and transportation sectors over time. And carbon emissions have dropped. They've dropped in part because we've had fuel substitution for electric power generation coming from the substitution of natural gas for coal. And while natural gas has its own issues, it's provided some significant benefits there. The transportation sector, in fact, is now larger than the electric power sector as a source of carbon. So that's a head scratcher, and points out the importance of trying to restructure the transportation sector as well. I think that there's a dynamic going on now that is really quite different, and that is that you do see large companies, you see electric utilities, you see many other parts of society stepping up to make aspirational commitments to reduce the carbon emissions to somewhere around zero between the years 2035 and 2050. Is that enough to prevent some of the consequences we will get from climate change? Probably not. Is it enough to keep things from getting worse? Yeah, it would be if those things are followed out. And companies are making these commitments for two reasons. One is they recognize there's a self-interest in it, that they in fact have risks associated with the changing climate, and they need to take action as anybody would to mitigate business risks. And the second thing is I think they see Gen Z as the consumers of the future, and Gen Z is going to be voting with their feet, and it's not going to be voting in favor of companies who are disregarding their own climate obligations. So there's some self-interest at work that I think helps to reframe the issue, and so you're not just relying on the government making you do things. That in fact, and that's what's really sort of a different dynamic than what you had in much of environmental regulation over the first 50 years of the modern environmental movement. So I have some hope associated with that. The businesses now recognize that they, in fact, have an interest in doing things to help minimize their environmental footprint.
And so I'd like to just add a couple of random comments, and these are my comments. You know, I'm here because of what I do in my job, but not everything I say might be representative of the local government positions. But, you know, it's my opinion that the environment's going to win. The planet will always be here. We talk about protecting the environment, but what I'm doing is really more selfish than that, trying to protect the security of the future of the human condition and the ability for, you know, our children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren to have a chance to have a healthy and fulfilling life on this great place that we all in this great place that we all share. And what I would like to remind the younger generation that you just referred to, I think you said Gen Z, is that, you know, you have an opportunity to make a big difference. And in my opinion, in the past, I think it's possible that not enough people cared enough to know or knew enough to care. And the more you understand about everything that we're discussing, the more likely you will be to influence the people around you to make more responsible decisions going forward, to reduce the, you know, wasteful use of natural resources and the unnecessary generation of pollution that affects everyone's health and affects the planet and the ecosystem that provides everything that we need to survive. So I think it is a hopeful message, and you have a great opportunity to do a better job than the generations that have come before you in demonstrating a level of effort and, you know, consciousness.
Miller, did you want me to take on the question that Olivia Etherton presented? Because that's a good question.
Yes, absolutely. Can you read it aloud so that everybody knows in case they don't have access to the chat box?
Sure, yeah. Olivia, I didn't want to take away your ability to ask the question yourself, but I'm happy to read it too. And Olivia's question was, could you describe instances of conflict in jurisdiction between federal and local levels and how those might be resolved? And then says, or does that not often happen? The good news, and I'll tell you, there are two stories. The good news is that in my experience in Region 4, it didn't happen very often. And it didn't happen very often, sometimes for slightly different reasons. Sometimes there was a little bit of a kind of a theater in this, and that political forces in a state would be leaning on the state or local agency not to take a particular action. And usually when that happened, since we had such good relationships, I get a phone call from a state commissioner who says, you know, you might want to look into this situation. And usually the notion that there was going to be a federal intervention in a particular situation was highly motivating to most parties to try to deal in a more straightforward manner with the state. We took a couple of actions that were federal actions because people didn't necessarily follow up on that particular piece of advice, and we found ourselves in a very compatible position with the state when that occurred. So we could serve to reinforce that. There's a phrase that was a probably unhappy phrase, but it was referred to as EPA's role as the gorilla in the closet, with the notion that you could deal with it gave states power if they could say with credibility, said, you can deal with me or you can deal with my friend over here in the closet. And that was helpful. Another example is was actually here in North Carolina involving the coal ash spill for Duke Energy, that initially the state took the position when that occurred that they could handle it, they had enough authority. But we called them up and talked to them and convinced them that it would be in their own interest for us to be able to proceed jointly with an appropriate enforcement response to that spill. And they saw wisdom in that and did so. And we got, I think, a better result or a better outcome as a result of that particular enforcement action. The one area where I can point to where there has been absolute conflict now is happily not in the Southeast. It's been in California, where the big conflict has been over California and their tailpipe standards. That because of the way the Clean Air Act is structured, California has an independent ability to set standards for motor vehicles, and they have been exercising it with respect to carbon emission limits for motor vehicles. Well, in the Obama administration, California and EPA came to a joint recognition and conclusion about what was a good timetable and set of standards for motor vehicles for carbon emissions, and put that into place as a national standard. So there was no conflict. In this administration, the administration decided they wanted to renege on that agreement and went back to roll back the carbon emission standards. California took the position that that was an unwise policy move and not justified by an analysis of cost benefits with respect to those standards, and has pursued their own path. So California is maintaining their own ability to set these standards. The federal government has been trying to negate California's authority, and the matter has ended up in court, where we'll find out how all that sorts itself out.
And I'm pleased to report that I can't recall a time that our county agency had any conflict with the state or federal agency. I mean, we do communicate well with each other. We work well together. We embrace a common mission, and it's really on a daily basis, or not quite daily maybe, but it's more common for them to pass something off to us and say, this is something going on in Forsyth County that we think you will want to and be able to address. Glad you're there to take care of it. Let us know if we can help. Let us know if you need, additional information, or if there's something that we can do to support your efforts. And like Dr. Meiburg said, having that gorilla in the closet can be really effective. And it's like, you can deal with us, but if you're not satisfied with the outcome, if you think that we're difficult to get along with, don't make me open that closet door. Because you'll a lot of times regret it, because they do have higher levels of authority, and sometimes, bigger penalties or more effective outcomes as far as doing the enforcement side of things. But I'm glad that, I can't think of a time that we've had like a conflict with another state or local agency. But that example in California is the perfect example. And, I think it's possible that, the federal government historically might not have been exactly consistent in their position to let, local governments deal with local issues and address local needs at the local level. In my opinion, they seem to be more likely to embrace that philosophy if the local government, if their philosophies and ideals are aligned with the higher level authorities. But when they're in conflict, sometimes that's not always the case. But there are a lot of political opinions in the world today regarding federal, state, and local authorities' responsibilities. Who's responsible for collecting taxes from the citizens, and who's responsible for using that revenue to carry out the different programs at the different levels. And, I mentioned that, I feel like we're not adequately resourced to do everything exactly the way I wish we could. And, it's not unpredictable that if there were federal or state regulatory changes that increased our workload and our required level of effort at the local level, that there might be some resistance at the local level to, increase the funding to carry out the new responsibilities or the additional programs. And that's just kind of the nature of the system.
That's actually a great observation. EPA gives about a little over $1 billion a year in grants to state, mostly directly to states, although some to local agencies too, in grant support for states and local agencies to carry out their air pollution responsibilities. And on the one hand, when I was sitting in that chair, you always wish you could do more. On the other hand, it was important for states and local governments to raise their own revenue. We just took an action and have just sent out to public hearing a rule to increase the fees that are being charged for Title V permits under the Clean Air Act, because the way in which the fees were being calculated wasn't adequately carrying out the responsibilities of the program. And to me, this is an example of the state of North Carolina taking a very responsible position to fund their own obligations and responsibilities as they're required to do under the Clean Air Act. So I was very pleased to see that action move forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for this amazing conversation. It looks like our time has come to an end, but I just want to say thank you to our guests and also remind y'all that if you want a Vote for the Planet sticker, go to www.peanc.org/vote. You can also view our candidate survey by going to peanc.org/candidate-survey. And you can also get a lot of tips around environmental legislation, voting, and all of that great stuff by following us on social media at PEANC.org. We will send the recording of this to all of y'all tomorrow. And yeah, I think we're good to sign off. Thank you, Dr. Meiburg and Miner, for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really a pleasure. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Good to see you again, Miner. Take care
Yeah,
of
you
yourself.
too. I'll be in touch soon.
Very good. Thanks.